Welcome to the 75th episode of our Crossing Thin Ice podcast series, where twice a month we tackle risk management topics. I'm Max Rudolph, and today my partner Dave Ingram will continue our VUCA series, this time addressing complexity. Understanding the difference between complicated and complex is key to success for a risk manager. How people react to events and the higher order impact of how other people react to those same events is fascinating for me to think about and implement proactively. Our aim for these Crossing Thin Ice offerings is to help with your ERM program and general risk knowledge. We encourage you to share with anyone interested in lifelong learning about risk management and welcome your feedback. As a reminder, nothing in today's podcast is intended to be investment advice. We're here to provide educational material on risk topics without getting lost in the weeds. Let's get started.
We often confuse complicated with complex. Complicated things have many, many parts and lots of ways to proceed. But one enduring characteristic of complicated situations is that they can be deconstructed, that is, split up into smaller parts, and fixing the parts will eventually lead to fixing the whole. It may not be easy, but complicated is eventually predictable. Think of a jet engine. It is complicated, but we expect that with the same inputs to get the same outcomes. Complex is much harder to deal with than that. Complex things cannot be taken apart to fix them. A key characteristic of a complex thing is that operation of one part often depends on the operation of another. And in a complex system, many of the parts may be adapting to the situation that keeps changing, and those changes are often a result of decisions of the parts. A complex system may be continually reorganizing. Did you follow that? Well, that paragraph is characteristic of the complex. And to make it worse, a complex system that remains stable for some period of time might trick us into thinking that it is merely complicated, and really slam us when it suddenly starts to adapt. For risk managers, this is a very important distinction. ERM programs were originally designed to deal with the highly complicated and volatile systems, but with stable loss distributions. The core task of the risk manager is to determine that loss distribution, the drivers of those losses, and to set up a control process that will regularly perform mitigations that can be developed in advance to manage risk-taking to predetermined limits that are consistent with a risk appetite. This falls apart in a complex world, or in a complex part of the world. The complex system is usually adaptive. The system changes and the loss distribution of the system changes over time. A simple example is to think of your company and its risk appetite. If you perceive that the world has gotten riskier, you may react by modifying your risk appetite and limits. That move will be repeated with other insurers. Reinsurers will react to both the change in loss distribution as well as the change in retentions of its customers, sometimes out ahead of the market and sometimes in arrears. This may result in a change in retention by the reinsurers or simply a change in price. You and your competitors will then react to those changes as well. There's no point at which that whole system stands still for you to do your careful control processes in that complex world. What makes the world so complex? Let's look at the past. In the 1990s, we were living at the end of the Great Moderation, when volatility and complexity were historically low, at least for some of us. Folks in the former Soviet Union and in the parts of Asia who suffered from the 1998 financial crisis would probably argue with that characterization. In the next decade, the first decade of the 2000s, saw a massive complexity arise through the interdependency of banks and non-bank financial institutions throughout the globe, both through direct transactions with each other and through concentration of many of them into the same home mortgage-related investments, which ultimately led to the global financial crisis and the unprecedented actions of central banks in reaction to that crisis. The 2010s saw complexity become a semi-permanent feature of the financial system. Central bank balance sheets ballooned, and interest rates of near zero around the globe created incentives for massive levered investment activities that changed the names and objectives of the owners of many, many firms. These new, purely financially motivated owners were typically much more reactive to market changes, making the entire economic system much more adaptive and complex. This led to high volatility in the financial markets, especially in the markets for derivatives used by risk managers for hedging. Meanwhile, financial regulation grew much stronger in reaction to the financial crisis, which led to reactions from banks and reactions from other financial market players to the banks. In this decade, complexity has increased to even higher levels with the advent of artificial intelligence and changes in weather/climate that could be the start of decades of climate change-related events. Geopolitical turmoils turned to armed conflicts with varying alignment of countries in different situations. Since the start of this decade, we have been advising any who would listen to look out for the most extreme result of all of this turmoil. That is, a regime change, the most complex event that we are likely to experience when some or all of the rules of human life change significantly in a fairly short period of time. And that is just the complexity that emerges from external forces. Insurers often make abrupt changes in the complexity of their own organizations, voluntarily. The most significant driver of such internal change is complexity in a merger. And insurers will often get that wrong. One of the drivers of mergers is the ability to combine like activities in two insurers and reduce some fixed cost by eliminating similar fixed expenses, resulting in a major drop in unit costs. But in many cases, the merger has increased complexity of the new combined organization. Parts of the two organizations fail to combine seamlessly, and a bifurcated culture results. Control theory, and in particular Ashby's law, tells us that to control a system, the control process needs to be at least as complicated as the system. Makes sense? When you combine two systems and they do not simplify down to one, then you have radically increased complexity, and the merger plans to reduce risk management and control staff works in the opposite direction of what is needed. When you combine two systems and they do not merge seamlessly, controlling the combined system will actually require more resources than the sum of the two companies' prior risk management and control systems. Few companies are aware of that dynamic, so most are understaffed and therefore under-controlled. This complexity means that the idea that consistent adherence to a well-designed risk management program is just not going to work. The risk manager needs to be able to adapt the risk management program as the rest of the world adapts to all that is going on. They need to adapt to outside complexity and to inside complexity. Much of complexity comes down to people, all acting and reacting to events and to each other. Risk management needs to join in that process instead of trying to manage risk in a static manner.
So Dave, can you elaborate on the core distinction between complicated and complex, perhaps using an example, and explain why confusing the two can be so detrimental in a business context?
I think it's a huge issue, particularly related to discussions about AI. In fact, the AI systems that we have now, the large language models, are excellent with complicated problems. And they're totally lost with complex problems. So you really do need to understand the difference, because there's no point in asking a complex problem of a large language model. You're going to get a hallucination or a very elementary answer to a complex question. For instance, you could say there are some extremely complicated problems. The complex problems are problems that are more like the ones that we face all the time, where the problem set is not bounded. The situation is not static either. There's not a certain number of spaces like the spaces on a chessboard. When you think about climate change, for instance, that's a complex problem. You have the extremely complicated weather systems, and I call them complicated. Some people call them complex. I'm not sure which they are. They're at that extreme of complicated that maybe it does tip into complex. But you have that And in addition, you have the human reactions, the human actions and reactions. And so a lot of complex systems fall into the category of what's called complex adaptive systems. The adaptive systems mean that within the system there are elements, often people, who change what they do to adapt to the changing situation. The complex systems, often there is not a single correct solution to a complex problem. Whereas to a complicated one, you can do a brute force calculation to get the answer to a complicated question. There is no brute force approach to a complex question. The complex questions, in addition, often have systems in them that are complex and they're complex because there's reinforcing and controlling feedback loops in them, where the reinforcing feedback loops cause elements in the system to sort of explode exponentially. The controlling feedback loops cause things to stay in a certain pattern. So I don't know if that helps, Max, but that's what I got.
No, that's interesting, and it helps me to put in context the difference between complex and complicated. That it really ties in with the human interaction with some of these events, and ties in with the behavioral side of it, and how everybody's not going to do the same thing every time, and you can only simulate what people might do. So that's interesting. I have another question for you, though. Traditional enterprise risk management programs started with highly complicated and volatile events with stable loss distributions. How does the adaptive nature of a truly complex system where loss distributions continually change, how does that change and indeed challenge the fundamental tasks of a risk manager?
Well, I always think of this in terms of the history of enterprise risk management. Enterprise risk management started developing in the mid to late 1990s, and it was and that was at the very end of a period of time that was called by some folks the Great Moderation. And that was the time when Alan Greenspan was famous for managing the economy so that there weren't any extremely bad periods of time. But that great moderation came to an end, and we developed enterprise risk management as a system that would work extremely well to help us during a moderate period of economics. And we haven't had a moderate period of economics since then. So we have this great ERM approach, and we have a world that's much more complex than the world we had during that great moderation. And what that means is, with the enterprise risk management system, it is built off of the idea that you build an enterprise risk model, and you use that to calculate your economic capital requirements, for instance, for an insurance company, and that you can manage your whole business off of that kind of calculation. The calculation is done with a stochastic model where you've got fixed distributions for every one of your risks, and you have correlation assumptions that manage the interplay between risks. So you've got thousands of scenarios, which is a lot, but it's a good approximation to the whole range of possibilities. In the complex world, that's not what happens. The distributions do not stay stable. You can imagine when we had these models, and then the financial crisis that were developed around the turn of the century and the 5 years after that or so, and then the financial crisis hits. The loss that we had, the stock market loss, for instance, which wasn't even the biggest problem in the financial crisis that happened, was a calendar year loss of 37% in the S&P 500. I asked a number of people that had these economic capital models where they would have placed that loss, and the average response was it would be about a 1 in 250 year event. Is that because they did a bad job modeling? No, it's because the world wasn't the world that they were modeling. The complex events, the complexity that happened that led to the financial crisis, which had a lot to do with the interconnectedness of all the financial market players, mostly the banks, but the banks in addition to the non-bank financial players, the hedge funds and so on, caused that crisis to just spin out of control in a way that was not in the data set. So that's the long answer.
Dave, you shared some complexity examples citing interdependency of financial institutions and the rise of financially motivated owners. In your view, what's the single most or group of significant factors driving the current new levels of complexity?
Oh, well, that was easy, Max. Certainly, the influence of artificial intelligence is huge there. I don't think 2, 3 years ago any of us would have picked that to be a big one, but it is risen up, and we really don't know now what AI is going to do for us. What is it going to do to us? There's an awful lot of complexity with that because so many people are using AI, and there's so few actual AI systems. So that interdependency that we saw in the financial crisis, for instance, is right there with the AI as well. So if there's a bug in the AI that people don't notice, everybody's going to have the bug. And climate change, which affects all of us again, has that same interdependency, reaching a phase where it is actually affecting things. It may not be the cause of all of the weather-related problems that we're seeing, but it's the cause of some of them. They don't come with a label telling us, yeah, this storm is a climate change storm. This storm isn't, but you gotta wonder as the storms are hitting. This year, the U.S. didn't have any major storms hitting the mainland. So does that mean that climate change is over? No, it just means we had a lucky year. We're also seeing the geopolitical turmoil. That's not new this year, but it's happening and it's continuing to rise up. And there are just quite a number of hotspots, and some of them are actively at war now, and some of them could be actively at war at any time, and we just don't know which one's going to tip that way. Max, what would you pick?
Well, I'd circle back on the climate change one. Probably not surprising that that's where I would go, but I think we've seen a couple things recently. The high ocean temperatures have really made these quick intensifying hurricanes. They've gone from a level 1 to a level 5, or if they move to a 6 at some point, they've gone like in 24 hours. And your example with hurricanes not hitting this year, I'm going to be watching over the next few years to see if that becomes more common. Because with the recent research coming out on the weakening of the currents going up through the Atlantic, the AMOC, I wonder if that has something to do with it, that there's not something pulling it towards the North American coast, and so it's going back towards Bermuda and directly to the UK and Europe rather than making a stop along the eastern coast first. So it'll be interesting to see all these things play out, but things are changing very quickly for sure. So Dave, mergers often increase internal complexity by failing to simplify and potentially creating a bifurcated culture. Something new to me is Ashby's law, but it states the control process must be at least as complicated as the system it controls. Why do mergers often result in understaffed and under-controlled risk management functions, given that it's a topic we already know needs to be addressed?
Well, I think there's kind of an imperative that happens. I've been sitting on the inside through, I think, at least three different major corporate mergers in my career. And in each one of them, there was a strong imperative to find some economies of scale. There was a target. You had to cut expenses, cut staff by 10% or 20%, or some number. And that number had a life of its own, and it wasn't necessarily rationally developed. Ashby's law tells you that you have to pay attention to how many nodes there are where you could possibly have a problem. It's a systems law. It's a computer systems law, actually. So that if you had 4 nodes in one company and 4 nodes in another company, and you were properly staffed to control each of those 4 nodes, each of those four, if you don't get rid of, if you manage to somehow or other not get rid of one of the two sets of staff, you could have 16 possible interactions there. And so instead of 4 and 4 is 8, or cut it down to 4, have a 50% reduction, you might need to double the staff from what you had there to be able to control all the nodes that are there. And it could be that some of those interactions could be interactions that are not just 1 plus 1 equals 2, it could be 1 plus 1 equals 11, because of interactions between the situations. So there's all kinds of possibilities for things to go wrong with that.
Well, Dave, I'm finding I thought I understood complexity fairly well, but as usual, your answers to these questions are adding to my knowledge. So let's give it one more question and see how much more I can learn. In a landscape where systems are continually adapting, it seems unlikely that a static manner of risk management will work. What practical advice do you have for risk managers on how they can and must adapt their programs to keep pace with complexity?
So it has to do with maintaining an adaptive position. So you have to consider that at any time you may get new information that tells you that you have to do something different. You think of it in terms of the classic steps in a risk management program, the first step being risk identification. I certainly had the attitude when I was first starting to do this risk management work, was that, boy, that risk management stuff, that's boring. I did it once, and why do I have to keep doing it every year? If you're in an adaptive system, you're in a complex system where you have some of these factors going on, you have to be looking around and be ready to change your risk identification at almost any time. And that's kind of the simplest way I can put this, is that you may be called upon, because of changes in the environment, called upon to change your risk register, change your risk identification at any time, and come up with new control processes to deal with that situation. And that may mean that you will have to be dialing up the importance of some new risk that you see. As we talked about a few minutes ago, AI risk. You certainly should be dialing up the importance of dealing with all the possible problems that can come about from implementing AI, because an awful lot of companies are going to be trying to implement something with AI. So you better be out there with the implementation of that, looking for how do you need to adapt your risk management system to deal with that.
Well, Dave, as our years of working together on the Emerging Risk Survey showed, every year it seemed like there'd be something new that would come up that we'd learn about a little bit, and that's kind of what has driven my interest in including emerging risk topics in this series where we talk about on the podcast, whether it's an evolving risk like climate change or something brand new like AI. There's just something new every year that I learn about, and I think by having that in my mind now, I tend to scan for things that are new. And so maybe I see them earlier than other people do. So maybe that's another recommendation for us, is to make sure you train yourself to look so that you're not recognizing an issue right after it occurs. Because a lot of these things you can anticipate in advance. Overall, thank you so much for making me a little bit smarter today.
Oh, you're welcome, Max.
The interconnectivity of risks is increasingly important to risk management. with artificial intelligence, climate change, and geopolitical turmoil leading the way. How strategies evolve with these higher order interactions, balancing risk and reward, is a skill set that risk managers should embrace and develop. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Crossing Thin Ice. If you found it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues.